Now that your husband is gone, pack your bags and leave. This house belongs to us now. Those were the words my daughter-in-law spoke exactly 7 days after we buried my husband. My son sat beside her at the dining room table and said nothing. Not a single word. For a moment I thought I had misunderstood. After all, grief does strange things to the mind. It had only been a week since I stood beside a gravesite holding white roses, saying goodbye to the man I had loved for 41 years. The house still smelled faintly of his coffee. His reading glasses were still on the end table beside his favorite chair. Every corner of that home carried a memory. Yet there I was, staring across the polished oak table while my daughter-in-law looked at me as if I were a guest who had overstayed her welcome. The room felt unusually cold despite the warm spring evening outside. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, each second seeming louder than the last. I looked at my son, hoping he would laugh and tell me it was some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, he lowered his eyes toward his plate. "Mom," he finally said, barely above a whisper. "Maybe it would be easier for everyone if you found a smaller place." Easier for everyone. The words settled heavily in my chest. I had raised that boy. I had worked double shifts when money was tight. I had sat beside hospital beds, attended every school event, celebrated every success, and comforted every failure. Yet now, when I needed family most, I felt completely alone. My daughter-in-law folded her hands neatly on the table. "We've already been looking at options for you," she said. "There are some nice apartments about 20 miles away." 20 miles. As if distance could somehow make their guilt easier to live with. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, not because I accepted what they were doing. I simply realized something important in that moment. They had already made their decision long before this conversation began. This dinner wasn't a discussion. It was an announcement. The silence that followed stretched across the room. Outside, a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically somewhere in the neighborhood. A dog barked in the distance. Life continued as if nothing extraordinary was happening. But inside that dining room, my entire understanding of family was changing. I stood carefully, smoothing the wrinkles from my navy blue sweater. Neither of them moved. Neither of them offered comfort. "I see," I said quietly. Then I picked up my purse and walked toward the front door. My son finally looked up. "Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be." I paused for just a second. Harder. The word almost made me smile. Because what neither of them knew was that my husband had spent years preparing for every possibility. And the next morning, I was about to discover something that would change everything. The night air felt colder than it should have as I drove away from the house. I did not know where I was going at first. I only knew I could not sit in that driveway another minute pretending my heart was not breaking. After nearly an hour of driving through quiet streets and dark neighborhoods, I checked into a small hotel just off the interstate. The room was simple. A bed, a lamp, a window overlooking a parking lot. Nothing about it felt like home. I sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the floral wallpaper while the events of the evening replayed in my mind. My husband had been gone for only 7 days. 7 days. Yet somehow my son and his wife had already mapped out my future without asking what I wanted. Sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my husband's smile. I heard his laugh echoing through the kitchen on Sunday mornings. I remembered the way he always carried groceries even when his knees started bothering him. We had spent 41 years building a life together. Not a perfect life, but a good one. Honest, steady, full of sacrifices and small victories. Around 6 o'clock the next morning, sunlight slipped through the thin curtains. I made myself a cup of coffee using the machine in the room and sat quietly watching the parking lot wake up. Delivery trucks arrived. Travelers loaded suitcases into cars. Everyone seemed to have somewhere they belonged. I wondered if I still did. Then I remembered something my husband had said about a year before he passed away. It had been an ordinary afternoon. We were sitting on our back porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the horizon. Out of nowhere, he had looked at me and said, "Promise me something. If anything ever feels wrong after I am gone, do not trust appearances. Go see Margaret." At the time I laughed and asked why he was talking like that. He only smiled and changed the subject. Margaret was his attorney, a careful woman who had handled our paperwork for years. Back then I never imagined I would need her. Yet sitting there in that hotel room, his words came back with perfect clarity. By 8 o'clock I was parked outside her office. My hands trembled slightly as I stepped out of the car. Not from fear. From uncertainty. The building looked exactly as I remembered. Red brick walls. White columns. A small American flag moving gently in the breeze. Inside, the receptionist greeted me warmly and disappeared down a hallway. A few moments later, Margaret appeared. The moment she saw me, her expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition. As if she had been expecting this visit all along. "I was wondering how long it would take," she said softly. Then she led me into her office, closed the door, and reached for a thick envelope sitting inside a locked drawer. The moment I saw my husband's handwriting across the front, I felt my heartbeat quicken. Whatever was inside that envelope, my husband had wanted me to see it only after something had gone terribly wrong. For a few seconds I could not bring myself to touch the envelope. My husband's handwriting stretched across the front in the familiar blue ink he always used. Seeing it again felt like hearing his voice from another room. Margaret sat quietly behind her desk, giving me time. Finally, I slid one finger beneath the seal and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter and several legal documents. The letter rested on top. My hands trembled as I unfolded the pages. "My dear Evelyn," it began. The sight of my name in his handwriting nearly broke whatever composure I had left. I took a slow breath and continued reading. He wrote that if I was holding the letter, something had happened that made me question the people around me. He said he hoped he was wrong. He hoped our family would stay united and kind after he was gone. But if events had led me to Margaret's office, he wanted me to know he had prepared for every possibility. I looked up at Margaret. She simply nodded toward the pages. "Continue," her expression seemed to say. The next paragraph changed everything. My husband explained that during the final 2 years of his life, he had noticed certain conversations that troubled him. Small things at first. Questions about property. Discussions about inheritance. Remarks made when they thought he was not paying attention. He never confronted anyone directly, but he paid attention. He always paid attention. Suddenly memories began surfacing in my own mind. My daughter-in-law asking unusual questions about insurance policies. My son casually bringing up real estate values. The way they occasionally exchanged glances whenever financial matters came up. At the time I dismissed it all. Reading those words now felt different. My husband had seen the same things. The letter directed me to the legal documents beneath it. I carefully lifted the first page. My eyes widened. The house was not owned the way my son apparently believed. Several years earlier, my husband had placed key assets into a protected family trust. The trust contained specific instructions and conditions. Margaret opened a folder and spread several documents across her desk. She explained everything patiently. The house could not be sold, transferred, borrowed against, or occupied permanently by anyone without meeting the conditions my husband had established. More importantly, I was the sole lifetime beneficiary. No one could remove me. No one could force me out. No one could make decisions about the property without my written approval. I stared at the papers. The silence inside the office felt almost unreal. Less than 24 hours earlier, I had been treated like an unwanted guest in my own home. Now I was discovering that my husband had quietly protected me years ago. "There is something else," Margaret said gently. She opened another folder and slid a document across the desk. "Your husband instructed me to show you this only if necessary." I lowered my eyes to the page. As I read the first few lines, a chill ran through me, because it revealed something my son and daughter-in-law had been trying to do behind my back for months before my husband's passing. And suddenly, their behavior at that dinner table made perfect sense. The document was a copy of several emails and meeting notes that had been preserved by my husband's financial advisor. I read each page slowly, hardly believing what I was seeing. Months before my husband passed away, my son had requested information about transferring ownership of the house. At first glance, it seemed innocent enough. Families discuss property all the time. But the deeper I read, the more troubling it became. There were questions about removing names from accounts. Questions about accelerating inheritance procedures. Questions about whether certain assets could be transferred before a death rather than afterward. None of those discussions had included me. Not one. Margaret watched quietly while I turned page after page. The office seemed unusually still. Even the traffic outside sounded distant. My husband had apparently become concerned enough to document everything. He had not accused anyone. He had not started arguments. Instead, he had done what he always did when faced with uncertainty. He gathered facts. He prepared. He protected the people he loved. A memory suddenly surfaced. About 18 months earlier, my son had insisted on helping organize some files in our study. At the time, I thought he was simply being thoughtful. My husband, however, had politely declined. I remembered the brief tension that followed. It lasted only seconds before everyone smiled and moved on. Back then, I forgot about it almost immediately. Sitting in Margaret's office, I realized my husband never had. Another memory followed. A family barbecue the previous summer. My daughter-in-law had spent nearly half an hour asking questions about property taxes, home values, and neighborhood appreciation rates. Everyone laughed and treated it as casual conversation. Looking back, the questions seemed strangely specific. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fit together. The painful part was not discovering their interest in money. People worry about finances. People make mistakes. The painful part was realizing how long they had hidden their intentions behind smiles, holiday dinners, and polite conversations. I felt sadness more than anger. Sadness for my husband, who must have carried these concerns quietly during his final years. Sadness for myself because I had been too trusting to see what stood directly in front of me. Margaret finally broke the silence. She told me my husband visited her office several times during the last year of his life. Each visit had the same purpose. He wanted to make certain I would never be vulnerable. He wanted safeguards, layers of protection, legal barriers that could not be manipulated through pressure, guilt, or family politics. Hearing that nearly brought tears to my eyes. Even while facing his own health struggles, he had been thinking about my future. Thinking about what might happen after he was gone. Thinking about dangers I refused to imagine. I looked down at the final page in the folder. At the bottom was a handwritten note from my husband. The message was short. Only one sentence. If you are reading this, remember who you are. You built this life with me. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. I read the sentence 3 times. Then I folded the paper carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Something inside me had changed. The grief was still there. The loneliness was still there. But beneath both of them, something stronger was beginning to emerge. Clarity. For the first time since the funeral, I was no longer reacting to what others wanted. I was beginning to see the truth. And before leaving Margaret's office that afternoon, I made a decision that neither my son nor my daughter-in-law would see coming. When I walked out of Margaret's office, the late afternoon sun felt different somehow. The world around me had not changed. Cars still moved through intersections. People still hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and grocery bags. Yet I no longer felt lost inside my own life. For the first time since my husband's funeral, I had something stronger than grief. I had certainty. I checked back into the same hotel that evening rather than returning home. Not because I was afraid. Because I needed time to think clearly. The small room felt less lonely than it had the night before. I placed the envelope on the desk beside the window and ordered a simple dinner. As I ate, I began making a list. My husband always believed that emotions should never make important decisions. Facts first. Feelings second. By the time the sun disappeared beyond the parking lot, 3 pages of notes sat beside me. The next morning I made several phone calls. One was to the trust administrator Margaret had recommended. Another was to the bank where my husband and I had maintained accounts for decades. Every conversation confirmed the same thing. The protections my husband created were active and fully enforceable. No shortcuts existed. No hidden loopholes existed. No amount of pressure could change the documents. Around noon my phone finally rang. My son's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. His voice sounded irritated rather than concerned. "Mom, where are you?" he asked. Not "how are you?" Not "are you safe?" Simply "where are you?" "I am fine," I replied calmly. A brief silence followed. "Well, when are you coming back?" he asked. I noticed the wording immediately. Not coming home. Coming back. As if my role had already changed. As if I were a visitor returning to someone else's property. I am handling a few things, I said. I will let you know when I am ready. Another pause. Then my daughter-in-law's voice appeared faintly in the background. She was clearly listening. My son lowered his voice. We need to talk about the house. There it was. Direct and unmistakable. Not the family. Not my well-being. The house. I looked out the hotel window at the rows of parked cars below. Months earlier, that conversation might have broken my heart. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew. We can discuss everything soon, I answered. There is information you should probably hear first. His tone shifted slightly. Confusion replaced confidence. What information? He asked. I smiled to myself. The kind your father wanted everyone to understand. I ended the call before he could ask another question. For the next several minutes, I sat quietly holding the phone. I could almost picture the expressions on their faces. They believed they were in control. They believed events were unfolding exactly as planned. What they did not know was that every assumption they had made rested on a foundation that did not exist. And before the week was over, they were going to learn exactly how carefully my husband had prepared for this moment. 3 days later, Margaret arranged a formal meeting at her office. Every relevant document had been prepared. The trust administrator would attend. So would my son and daughter-in-law. I spent that morning in complete silence. Not because I was nervous. Because I finally understood something my husband had always known. The truth does not need to shout. It only needs to be revealed. I arrived 15 minutes early. Margaret greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room with a long walnut table. Sunlight filtered through tall windows overlooking the city. A pitcher of water sat in the center beside several neatly organized folders. Everything looked calm, professional, orderly. Nothing like the emotional storm that had brought us there. My son and daughter-in-law arrived a few minutes later. The moment they saw me, both seemed surprised by how composed I looked. My son offered a brief smile. My daughter-in-law carried herself with the same confidence she always displayed when she believed she was in control of a situation. They sat across from me. For several moments nobody spoke. Then my daughter-in-law broke the silence. "We are glad you agreed to meet," she said. "We really need to discuss practical next steps." Practical. That word again. As though a lifetime could be reduced to a checklist. Margaret folded her hands calmly. "That is exactly why we are here." The trust administrator opened a folder and began reviewing the legal structure my husband had established years earlier. At first my son seemed relaxed. He nodded occasionally, barely paying attention. Then the details became more specific. The house belonged to the trust. The trust could not be altered without strict legal conditions being met. I remained the sole lifetime beneficiary. No individual heir possessed authority over occupancy decisions. No forced relocation could occur. No transfer could take place without my consent. The change in their expressions happened gradually. My son sat straighter in his chair. My daughter-in-law stopped taking notes. By the time the administrator finished explaining the protections, neither of them looked comfortable anymore. Then came the final document. Margaret slid it carefully across the table. It contained my husband's written instructions regarding the family property and future inheritance distributions. My son read silently for several seconds. His face lost color. He looked at the page again as if hoping the words would somehow change. "This cannot be right," he said quietly. Margaret's voice remained steady. "It is completely valid." The room fell silent. My daughter-in-law finally spoke. "Why would he do this?" There was frustration in her voice, but something else too. Fear. I looked directly at her for the first time since the meeting began. "Because he paid attention." Nobody responded. The silence stretched across the room. Years of assumptions were collapsing one piece at a time. For months, perhaps even years, they had believed the future was already decided. They had acted accordingly. Now they were learning that my husband had quietly rewritten the ending long before any of us reached this moment. My son stared down at the papers in front of him. For the first time since that dinner, he looked less certain of himself than I had ever seen him. And as I watched him struggle to process the truth, I realized the hardest conversation was still waiting to happen. My son remained silent long after the meeting should have ended. The documents were spread across the table between us like mirrors reflecting choices nobody wanted to acknowledge. My daughter-in-law was the first to recover. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said. Margaret did not respond. Neither did the trust administrator. Facts have a way of ending arguments before they begin. My son rubbed his forehead and stared at the pages. For the first time he looked less like a confident adult and more like the young boy who used to come to me whenever life became confusing. The difference was that this confusion was entirely of his own making. Eventually he looked at me. "Mom, why did you not tell us any of this?" The question almost made me smile. Not because it was funny, because it revealed how completely he had misunderstood the situation. "I did not know," I answered honestly. "Your father kept these protections private." My son lowered his eyes again. The room fell quiet. I could almost feel the weight of my husband's absence sitting beside us. He should have been there. He should have been the one explaining why he made those decisions. But in a strange way he already was. Every document carried his voice. Every safeguard carried his concern. Every signature carried his love. My daughter-in-law finally pushed her chair back. "We were only trying to help," she said. The statement hung in the air. Nobody challenged it. Nobody supported it. I simply thought about that dinner. About the certainty in her voice when she told me to leave. About the apartment 20 miles away they had already researched without asking what I wanted. About the plans they made while I was still grieving. Help was not the word I would have chosen. Yet I no longer felt the need to argue. Some truths reveal themselves without assistance. The meeting ended shortly afterward. My son lingered behind while everyone else gathered their papers. When we were finally alone, he spoke quietly. "Mom, I never wanted things to happen like this." I studied his face. There was regret there. Genuine regret. But regret and responsibility are not the same thing. "Then why did they?" I asked. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. No answer came. Because the real answer would require him to confront choices he had spent months avoiding. After a long silence, he stood and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back once. "Are you coming home?" The question sounded different this time. Not possessive. Not entitled. Just uncertain. I thought about the house waiting for me. The photographs on the walls. The porch where my husband and I watched thunderstorms roll across the horizon. The life we built together. "Yes," I said calmly. "I am going home." As the door closed behind him, I gathered my belongings and picked up the envelope containing my husband's letter. For the first time since the funeral, I felt ready to walk through that front door again. But I also knew something important had changed forever. The house was still standing exactly where I left it. The family inside it, however, was not. The drive back felt strangely peaceful. The same roads that had seemed uncertain a few days earlier now felt familiar again. When I turned onto my street, I slowed for a moment and looked at the row of houses bathed in afternoon sunlight. Children rode bicycles near the corner. A neighbor watered flower beds. Life moved forward as it always had. Yet for me, everything felt different. I pulled into the driveway and sat quietly behind the steering wheel. The house stood exactly as I remembered. The white shutters. The maple tree my husband planted 20 years ago. The porch swing we used every summer evening. For a moment, memories rushed toward me all at once. Birthday celebrations. Holiday dinners. Late-night conversations. Ordinary moments that had quietly become treasures. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door. Before I could reach it, the door opened. My son stood there. He looked tired. Older somehow. The confidence he carried during that dinner was gone. We stared at each other for several seconds. Neither of us seemed to know where to begin. Finally, he stepped aside. "Welcome home, Mom," he said softly. The words carried an honesty that had been missing for a long time. I nodded and walked inside. The familiar scent of the house immediately surrounded me. My husband's favorite chair remained in its usual spot beside the living room window. A book still rested on the side table where he had left it. Seeing those details hurt, but it was a gentler pain now. Not a wound. More like a reminder of love. My daughter-in-law appeared in the hallway. Unlike my son, she seemed uncomfortable. She avoided direct eye contact and folded her arms across her chest. For a few moments nobody spoke. Then she surprised me. "I should not have said what I said," she admitted quietly. The apology was brief, imperfect, perhaps even incomplete, but it was more than I expected. I simply nodded. Some conversations require time before they can become honest. We spent the rest of the afternoon in awkward silence. Everyone moved carefully around one another, as though learning a new language. Later that evening after dinner, I carried a cup of tea onto the back porch. The sun was beginning to set. Orange light stretched across the yard. The porch swing creaked softly as I sat down. It was the exact place where my husband and I spent countless evenings talking about everything and nothing. I reached into my purse and removed his letter once more. My eyes settled on the sentence I had already read dozens of times. "Remember who you are." I smiled sadly. For days, I had focused on protecting the house because it represented safety. But sitting there alone, I realized the house was never the true inheritance my husband left behind. His real gift was something far more valuable. It was the reminder that dignity cannot be given away by other people. It can only be surrendered. And for the first time since the funeral, I knew with absolute certainty that I was never going to surrender mine again. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Outwardly, life returned to normal. Meals were prepared. Bills were paid. The lawn was trimmed every Saturday morning. Yet beneath those ordinary routines, something had shifted permanently. The illusion that had existed within our family was gone. Nobody pretended otherwise. My son began stopping by the porch more often in the evenings. Sometimes he would sit across from me with a cup of coffee and talk about ordinary things. Work, weather, neighbors. The conversations were cautious at first. Like two people rebuilding a bridge one board at a time. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he finally asked the question I knew had been weighing on him. "Did Dad stop trusting me?" The sadness in his voice caught me off guard. I looked out across the yard before answering. "I do not think that was ever the issue," I said quietly. "I think he stopped trusting certain decisions." My son lowered his eyes. The distinction mattered. Yet it also hurt. We sat in silence for a while. The distant sound of a lawnmower drifted through the neighborhood. Finally, he nodded slowly. I should have listened more. It was not a dramatic confession. It was not a speech filled with excuses. It was something rarer. An honest acknowledgement. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law remained polite but distant. The confidence she once carried had disappeared. Sometimes I would catch her watching me with an expression I could not quite read. Perhaps it was embarrassment. Perhaps regret. Perhaps both. One afternoon, several weeks after the meeting, I found her standing alone in the kitchen. She seemed surprised when I walked in. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she set down the dish towel she was holding. "I thought everything would be easier after your husband passed," she admitted quietly. The words sounded strange in the stillness of the room. Not cruel. Just painfully honest. She stared at the countertop as she continued. "I kept telling myself we were planning for the future. I convinced myself that made it acceptable. I listened without interrupting. There was a time when I might have argued. A time when I might have listed every hurtful thing she had done. But age teaches certain lessons. One of them is that people rarely change because they are defeated. They change when they finally see themselves clearly. The future arrives on its own," I said gently. "It does not need to be rushed." Her eyes filled with emotion, and for the first time since all of this began, I saw something genuine there. Not calculation, not strategy, just humility. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked through the house alone. I paused beside family photographs hanging along the hallway. Vacations, graduations, birthday parties, decades of memories frozen behind glass. I realized something important as I stood there. My husband had protected more than property. He had protected time. Time for truth to emerge. Time for people to confront themselves. Time for healing to become possible. And standing there beneath the soft hallway light, I began to wonder whether the greatest part of his plan had never been the trust at all.